many times over. In the same way, anyone who holds on to life just as it destroys that life. But if you let it go, reckless in your love, you'll have it forever, real and eternal. If any of you wants to serve me, then follow me, and then you'll be where I am, ready to serve at a moment's notice. The Father will honor and reward anyone who serves me. Right now, I am storm-tossed. And what am I going to say? Father, get me out of this. No, this is why I came here in the first place. I'll say, Father, put your glory on display. A voice then came out of the sky. I have glorified it, and I'll glorify it again. The listening crowd said, thunder, and others said, an angel spoke to him. And Jesus said, the voice didn't come for me, but for you. At this moment, the world is in crisis. Now Satan, the ruler of this world, will be thrown out. And I, as I am lifted up from the earth, will attract everyone to me and gather them around me. He put it this way to show how he was going to be put to death. This is God's good word for God's good people.
Thanks be to God.
One of the issues that follows us through life is that of identity. Who am I? We're always asking ourselves to take self-inventory, to look at who do you see in the mirror? Who are you? And then how do you identify yourself? And then the surprising realization and question that arises is, who defines me? That always seems to come up. Who defines me? Because in reality, you're not the only person that constructs your identity. None of us do this in a vacuum. But in the case of BIPOC people, some of these identities precede us even before we get here from being birthed from our mother's womb. Many currents, influences, myths, and forces outside of ourselves frame who I am and frame who you are, and who we are collectively. When you think about this, think about who America is. We are literally one of the countries, if not the only country, that has people from everywhere else on the globe, right here. But what is the thing about that? Do we see this as a lovely garden with all different kinds of vegetation and flowers all growing symbiotically? Is that what we see? Or is it something different? I want to give you a couple of examples of how identity shows up in the garden. I may be American, but if I'm also a Muslim, I'm sometimes under the suspicion of being a terrorist. If I'm Latinx with an accent, I'm often perceived to be undocumented. You know, that ugly word, illegal. And if I am African American, then I must be on welfare or be a thug. And if I'm Asian, and when I say Asian, often we're not thinking of people like Kamala Harris, who is of Indian descent in Southeast Asia, but we think that that only means Pacific Rim. And then we go on to think that men who are from that particular ethnicity are karate black belts, and or either they can be academic nerds. And then we look at the women and we think that they're docile and meek and studious, or either they're dominatrix and they are sex objects for men to objectify. And of course, with all of the groups that I just mentioned, there is the bias that we don't speak English well. I think you are seeing where I am coming from and how this becomes an added layer to our collective identities, ones that many of us had nothing to do with fostering, but have been born into this, whether it be for good or for bad. And national identity plays a big part in this. It is a major current that molds our imaginations. It shapes an identity as a people, as a nation, for example. What do we say about the United States of America? Oftentimes we just say America, but we forget Canada is America, Mexico is America, but we need to be clear and say the United States of America. And in our context, one of the things that we always say is that we are one nation under God, right? That's a particular identifying marker, that we're one nation under God. which means really it brings in all people from different faith backgrounds, different ways of looking at the Holy Creator. We didn't say one nation under Jesus. We said one nation under God. But no matter how that particular national story is construed, the myth has been established that we are one nation under God, whether we act like it or not. And that myth is always, almost always based on a white-bodied person, and usually male in our particular context. We are a unique people with a privileged place. The American myth defines a nation, the land of the free and the land of the brave, right? We're the land of the free and the brave. And we are also the people chosen by God, freed from the past to lead into an unlimited, wonderful future. Everything and everyone is there for us. But as my friend Amber Ruffin so succinctly put it, she says, in actuality, we are the land of the thieves and the land of the slaves. And if we were honest about that, we might not be where we are today. If we were honest about who Jesus is and who his mother was and where he came from, we might not be where we are today in our U.S. context. Because you see, everything so far about what identifies us as U.S. Americans or as people has been based on a lie. Not that the truth wasn't there, but we chose to tell the lie rather than to tell the truth. And so we have to ask ourselves, what identity do we identify with? One that has been put out there that is a myth, or the one that is our God-given right that Jesus came to make sure we understood? This is a strong and often unconscious guide that impacts our speech with one another and shapes our perceptions of one another. The media uses this guide to create an image of what they consider the real American, most often the white American. And unfortunately, the myth that we have often been given looks a lot like the same people who stormed the Capitol in January. Not like those of us who attend Cross Church and look like the garden with all of its wonderful blends and mixtures and differences that create beauty in the world. I am reminded this week what Reverend William Barber said, that white supremacy is a lie teller and a life taker. And if it is left unchallenged by truth, life, and love, it will take the life of innocent Asian women. It will take the life of unarmed black men, women, and boys, and take the life of Latinx children at the border, and will forget about the life that existed as the indigenous population already here, if we choose to leave it unchallenged. I find this very interesting because I've been reading a whole lot lately, going back to things of Malcolm X, Bonhoeffer, MLK, and a lot of different feminist writers with respect to how the landscape has been shaped for us and where we find ourselves today. And I found it really interesting that in the 1980s, poet and writer and activist and feminist Audre Lorde opined the following, that the 60s indeed were characterized by a potent belief in instantaneous solutions. They were vital years of awakenings for so many people, white people, BIPOC people, about our pride, about our era, and about our misconceptions of one another. The civil rights and black power movements rekindled possibilities for disenfranchised groups within this nation. Even though we fought common enemies, at times, the lure of our individualistic solutions made us careless to one another. Sometimes we could not bear the face of each other's differences because of what we feared those differences might really say about us, ourselves. As if everybody can't eventually be too black, too white, too brown, too yellow, too red, too man, too woman, or something in between. But any future vision which can encompass all of us, by definition, must be complex and expanding, and of course is not going to be a simple fix. The answer to cold is heat. The answer to hunger is food. But there is no simple monolithic solution to racism and its cousins, sexism and homo and transphobia. There is only the conscious focusing within each of our days to move and actively fight against them. Wherever we come up against these particular manifestations of this same disease, by seeing who the we is, we learn to use our energies with greater precision against our enemies rather than against ourselves. Now that sounds a lot like building the beloved community, does it not? So thankfully, Jesus confronts us with a radically different identity, an identity forming process. He even gives us instructions on how to do it, because he knows we just can't seem to follow directions, so he's got to lay it out again. And as he journeys towards the cross, he takes the time to do this very radical, different thing. Over the past few weeks, we have seen how in the Gospel of John, it presents a clear image of who Jesus is from the get-go. We don't even have to guess. It lays it out for us very clearly. From his cleansing of the temple, we see who Jesus is and what he tolerates, what he finds acceptable, and what he finds abhorrent. We know that Jesus is the Word of God who makes God known to all of us. And at the same time, Jesus is also the one who stands among us as the one whom you do not know. He keeps repeating that at different places, but particularly in the first book of John. And then throughout this gospel, Jesus reveals his identity through the many signs. Because, of course, he can't just say something because we get lost. So he has to show us with various examples of who he is and what he has been sent here to accomplish. By turning the water into wine, by healing the man born blind, by actually raising his best friend Lazarus. And now as he journeys through this final day before Passover, in and out of the city, towards the cross, he reveals an even deeper level of who he is and what his identity is. In our gospel text this morning, we heard the Greeks make a surprising entry upon the scene. They are curious, they have come from a long way, and they want to see who this Jesus person is. Almost nothing is said about them or why they ask Philip, or why even Philip goes and tells Andrew rather than going straight to the source to let Jesus know these Greeks are asking about him. And as a sidebar, we need to understand that in this context, we're not talking about the Greeks of Plato's and Socrates. That whole thing has already passed and gone. So they don't have that wonderful reputation that they're standing on at this point. When they talk about Greeks in this case, it's meaning foreigner. They're, just some people from someplace else. And so if we understand that is meant that they're non-Jewish people from outside. John indicates the ever-expanding reach of how much Jesus is able to influence through his identity of who he is to other people who don't even follow necessarily and understand what he is about. But because of the things he's done, he draws people to him from far away. The one whom we do not know is now drawing all the nations and all peoples to himself. Almost as quickly as the Greeks appear, they disappear again, almost without much notice. But their sudden entry within the fabric of this story reveals something to even Jesus. The hour has now come. Jesus is already being lifted up, even as he journeys towards the cross. The hour has come for a fuller revelation of who he is, his identity. It is precisely this arrival of foreigners, of strangers in the midst, that identifies the crucial hour for Jesus. This realization that the hour and the end have come unsettles even Jesus. And we witness another side, the human side of Jesus, the more vulnerable side of Jesus, one that, if we are honest, may make us a bit uncomfortable, as it doesn't come up that often that we see this type of vulnerability with Jesus that lets us know that he also had fears, he also had concerns, but he still was willing to stick the path, stay the course, and do what his Father had commanded. Clearly, he is going through it. To know what kind of path lies before you. Can you imagine? Because we know and we hear this about Jesus, but we have modern people that, for some of us, I think probably everybody in this room, except for maybe Mr. Roscoe today, knew and heard Martin Luther King Jr. and heard him talk about how he had seen what should happen and what the promised land or what the promised garden should look like, but that he knew he wouldn't make it there. He already knew that. For us, that's another story, but it's a story about somebody that we actually knew was flesh and blood. Not that we don't think Jesus was flesh and blood, but it's a little bit harder for us to wrap our arms around at times. But when we know that the prophets that have descended from Jesus in Jesus' time to modern day are like Martin Luther King Jr., like Dorothea Huerta, like Malcolm X, like Martin Luther King, like Bonhoeffer, then it makes it more real for us to understand that that identity that was formed in Jesus has also been passed down to us as part of our inheritance. And so when we look at that, we see that Jesus is able to struggle deep within his own understanding of who he is. That in his own troubled soul, we have a glance of who he is and how human he was. When I recall again how he cried and wept over the death of his friend Lazarus. We see again when he is in deep gratitude and relishes the washing of his feet by Mary. And here again, Jesus reveals the struggle. A struggle now witnessed in his dialogue with the Father that we hear in prayer when he says, "When I am lifted up, I will draw all people to myself." Of course, when Jesus was lifted up on the cross, people fled. Even his closest friends were like, "I'm out of here, dude, because this isn't looking good. And anybody attached to you is probably going to be next." So they hid it. And yet, embracing and living into this reality and actually dying into this, Jesus began to draw the world to himself. So once again, there is an entry, a dramatic entry within this text. A voice from heaven, now God's voice, breaks in on the scene. And to everybody else, it sounds like thunder or perhaps a voice, a foreign voice from outside that is unrecognizable, untranslatable, but confirms the identity of who Jesus really is, the Word of God made flesh. God is glorified by Jesus, who is not looking to get something for himself. So this isn't about Jesus, but it is simply the wish that all may be drawn to what God has to offer in God's gracious heart. That Jesus walks this path, that all may know God, not through ideology or through misguided patriotism or even theology, but in communion with one another, in accompaniment with one another. This path that Jesus chooses to walk has a different kind of identity. This identity finds its fullness, its worth, in the joy of giving and in drawing all towards this type of love, in drawing all towards himself. And a new identity is given the abundance, the fullness, the life, and the life eternal. This is the kind of identity that is a part of our birthright, not this mythological one that we adopt and decide to own from misguided narratives that we had nothing to do with constructing. For us, when we look at Jesus, this is a radical new identity. The problem, though, that we have is that we're imperfect creatures. We just got to be honest, right? We're imperfect. And particularly in our U.S. context, because we think we all got it going on compared to the rest of the world, and perhaps it's being laid very bare that we don't. And that oftentimes our rugged individualism that has been instilled in us through school, social circles, all sorts of places, propels us to want to shape and mold our own identity, which is so often devoid of anything that is sacred. So when we talk about hearing the grains that fall and die, that's part of us when we can't connect to one another, when we don't understand who we are. Because we often buy into the mold that is offered to us by our culture, by the American dream or the American myth of privilege with certain folks that are at the center. We judge others according to that mythical identity, like the domestic terrorist that took it upon himself to blame Asian women for the stereotype of objectification that they had nothing to do with, but that was a part of a reality way back in war times and then has been exported back to the United States as a reality that is not true. He bought into that to satisfy whatever lewd thing was going on inside of him, and then decided to turn it around and kill these innocent women who were serving the community in an upstanding profession. Because since when has running a spa and offering mani-pedis been a seductive thing? Since when has that made you want to have sex with someone when someone goes in to get their feet cleaned and polished and their hands done? I don't know, but I've never experienced that. But we know that that was just convenient, because since never has that been the case. This was just a poor excuse that any of us with an ounce of intelligence know was, again, a lie. I told you earlier from Reverend William Barber's thing that white supremacy is about lying and not truth-telling. And so here it is again, instead of him just being honest and saying that he couldn't get what he wanted, then he decided to take them out. And now, because he got caught, we want to blame it on, I don't want to be sinful, as if killing someone isn't sinful. But then that might mean that they can take the hate crime off the table, which then would mean he doesn't necessarily have life, right? Do we see how calculated this is? It's right there in black and white. And so he thought he would get away with it after all. And why shouldn't he? So many at the Capitol did in January, and in so many other incidents where white men have been responsible for killing innocent people of color, they have not been punished. And so why would we think that he would think anything different? Because unfortunately, that has been the narrative that has been put out there, that for people who are so misguided, so lost, so hateful, that they also buy that part of the myth as well, that to this point seems to be reality. The racism coupled with privilege in this country emboldens these type of misguided souls. All those who are not like them become objects of fear. Americans and immigrants who need to be expelled or relegated to specific places, like we need to live in particular neighborhoods, we need to work in specific kinds of jobs. BIPOC people who need to be under secret surveillance, tracking all of our movements and conversations, sometimes even the conversations of children, because we're seen as the other. Labeling those of us on the fringes, the margins, as radical extremists. When we peacefully march and rally that our lives matter, we are demonized and called the enemy. But who are the ones that even in the face of danger will go to any means to maintain their control, power, and identity? We saw this with the rhetoric of Trump before and throughout his presidency, and many of his staffers, and the fact that mostly white men and a few white women refused to vote to have him impeached for inciting the resurrection on the citadel of our country, the Capitol. Again, this is a clarion call to white supremacists that it is open season on BIPOC people and they can get away with it. Beloved people, if we don't call out these white supremacists masquerading as Christians and giving those who are evangelical, like us here in the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America and also at Cross, a bad name and suggest that we share the same theology, they are grossly in error and we need to tell them so. We all must address the systemic brokenness and sinfulness within organized religion. Have we forgotten that we watched with disbelief, then horror, as the Capitol was sieged by mostly church people? They profess to be Christian, espousing lies and hateful speech. We must stop looking outside of our organizations for the demons that lie within us. In the end, we eliminate the possibility of the other, the Greek, blasting into our tightly orchestrated scenario. We avoid the deeper confrontation with a God-given identity that speaks to truth deep within each one of us, and to the possibility to create a clean heart that is reconciled, where we shall no longer teach or say to each other, "Know the Lord, for we shall all know God, from the least to the greatest, and from the insider to the outsider, from national to foreign." It is interesting to me today that as we heard the story about the grains of wheat and the garden, Let us not forget as we move into Holy Week, Palm Sunday first, and then Holy Week, that how do seeds that fall to the ground, that can be watered, can be nurtured, can be cared for, but that if they don't receive the sunlight, which is the Spirit from the Lord, how do they then come up as something good and something new and something that is wonderful? We need to look at, we are the seeds that are fallen to the ground. What are we being nourished with? What are we identifying with? Are we the grains that will give eternal life as we come up and embrace all people and try and live in abundance together? Or are we only in it for ourselves to continue destruction at the cost of everyone and perhaps even this country? In the name, unfortunately, of God and Jesus. We need to have a come to Jesus moment in our reckoning of who we are in our souls as we journey towards Resurrection Sunday, and before that, Good Friday. Let Good Friday not be an eternity for you, but decide that on Good Friday, it's time to come out of the grave and journey towards new life. Amen.